Hi, and welcome to this podcast with me, Geeta Joshi. I'm here today with Sebastian Martorana. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you. Thanks, Geeta, for having me.
So we're going to be talking about your work, and I know you mostly as a sculptor, particularly of stone and marble, but you started out as an illustrator. So how did you digress from that into your current dominant discipline?
Yeah, illustration was my major as an undergrad. So I went to Syracuse University, and Syracuse has a campus in Florence, Italy. And I had become interested in stone sculpture back in my high school years and done a little bit in Virginia, where I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. And during college, I spent a semester over in Italy, and it kind of broke my painting bone, and I decided, stone sculpture is what I wanted to do and really focus on. So I came back and I completed my degree in illustration and did go on to do, kind of more traditional two-dimensional illustration work, but became an apprentice, or started working actually at a stone shop while I was still an undergrad, and became a full-time apprentice thereafter, and worked at a stone shop outside of DC for a number of years before going back to graduate school, where I specifically studied sculpture here in Baltimore, where I am to this day.
And how long was your apprenticeship?
It was about 4 years.
And what were you sort of learning there? Was that mostly around masonry, or was it more fine art sculpture?
It was. It was a stone shop outside of Washington, D.C. Called Manassas Granite and Marble. Well, so the stone shop itself was specifically industrial carving. So they were not a fine art type of operation. The people working there were, specifically carvers. That's how they would self-refer. They were not artists or sculptors, which was exactly what I was looking for at the time. I really wanted to learn the craft of carving, so that way I could apply it to the concepts I was interested in addressing in the artwork. So that kind of worked out for me. Anytime we had something that was somewhat sculptural, which occasionally would come through, I pretty much got full control over it in terms of, the modeling and stuff like that, which was fun. And then it just was a matter of the time and, the years of practice to kind of catch up, or allow the skills to catch up to, where my ideas were.
Okay. So have you ever made like a really big mistake and then had to kind of, sort of redesign the work to accommodate that?
Not that I'll ever show you.
Okay. The short answer is no, of course not.
No, honestly, the man under whom I specifically apprenticed, Tim Johnston, his general advice to me on every project was basically, go slow, take your time, and don't make any mistakes. And that's pretty much how I still think of every project I do, whether it's something sculptural or whether it's something particularly commissioned or industrial, which I know kind of flies in the face of many contemporary artists practice the idea of making mistakes, and that's great. Well, it kind of depends on the project, of course. If it's something that I'm doing for myself or that's self-directed, I may go into it with that mindset, and that mistakes can be interesting, and those things do happen. There's a lot of stuff I do on the fly as a stone sculptor when I'm working on my own sculptural work. But, if I'm carving a chunk of, the National Basilica or St. Patrick's Cathedral or Johns Hopkins University, it's really not the best time to make a mistake.
Okay, understood. And what about this? So just talking about the material, like with marble and things like that, they have a grain, or, does that actually affect how you, would form, the piece around?
That's a good question. To some degree, with stone, really the crystal structure is far more important than the grain of the stone. So to define, if people aren't familiar, the grain really would refer to the direction of the veining in the stone, rather than, and people think of it like wood, like when I do wood carving as well. And in wood carving, the grain of is particularly important. You really do have to change the direction you're carving based on the grain of the wood, or the type, or the direction of the way that the grains themselves interlock. Mm-hmm. Stone carving, the grain can affect that, but it really depends on the type of stone. But more than anything else, what's affecting the way you're carving it is the crystalline structure. So some stones have a larger or smaller crystal structure. If we're talking about marble specifically, the best analog I can give or metaphor would be I kind of describe it like digital photography. So for instance, white Carrara marble, which is always prized as the best, carving marble, would be something that I would describe as, say, a 600 DPI TIFF file, very high resolution, high quality, very consistent. Whereas you may move to, our, in America, domestic marble, say like Imperial Danby or something like that, or Royal Danby from Vermont or Alabama might be a 300 to a 150 DPI TIFF file. Moving away from that, the stone I have here in Baltimore would say be a 150 to 72 DPI JPEG, whereas something like Georgia marble, obviously from Georgia in the southern U.S., would be described as, very large crystals, basically your lowest quality Snapchat photograph you can think of, So that's kind of the spectrum, even just within marble.
I love that analogy. That's a really good one, especially because I was reading something just recently that you'd written around how, obviously, like the size and weight and exposure of your work doesn't get seen as much, but actually we know it more through pixels because we see it more on, like social media lets you kind of reach an international audience as well.
Well, yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
What do you think are the perceptions of the discipline of carving and sculpture at the moment in contemporary art?
Yeah, it's tough. I think that it's been my experience that people tend to look at stone sculpture and think of it as being something that is de facto extremely traditional, or the people that are doing it are particularly traditionally minded or very conservative in their artistic interests. And, I don't think of it that way at all. I don't think of the work that I'm doing as neoclassical or something like that. I think of it as the sculptural work as being contemporary art, just because I'm alive now and I'm making it. Whereas, a person that's not familiar with it, typical viewer that would be predisposed to not be interested in stone carving or see it as contemporary art, may walk into a show full of stone sculpture and just say, oh my gosh, this is so dated, or this is so traditional, which I find, I guess, maybe unfair, because no one ever walked into, a show that was full of oil painters or painting in general and just say, this is so 35,000 years ago, this is so dated, because, painting is far older than stone sculpture. So I think we're kind of the new guys on the block in that sense.
So that's very much like about people not being able to see past the material, and then their associations of it always being from whatever memorials in the town square or museum, right. Like 19th century or Renaissance sort of collections in museums.
Yeah, and that's true, because it is difficult for someone, I think, to look past, as you said, the material itself, because it is so loaded. It's got a lot of baggage, and also, there's not a ton of it around. There are a ton of people making it, so people would look at the material and have a difficult time seeing past the craftsmanship required to make the object. And their process of understanding the artwork is interrupted by their predisposition to see the history of the craft as a whole first, rather than trying to figure out what is the sculpture saying conceptually, rather than just how the heck did they make it. And those two things aren't necessarily bad. They're only bad if one interrupts the other. I like to think that every sculpture I make can be appreciated by someone that has, a PhD in art, and someone who has absolutely no interest in art whatsoever. Because if they're going to appreciate it, say, on a conceptual level, or appreciate it on a more formal level, technically, that's fine. I only really have a problem with that if someone looks at it and says, I can't appreciate this on a conceptual level because it has a technical level. That to me doesn't really make any sense. But I think that, I know I've encountered that specifically. So that's always disappointing. But I'm not gonna try to do things poorly to accommodate that particular vantage point.
And as well as your fine art sculpture, what else do you do?
I spend a great deal of my time working on commissioned projects that tend to be for institutional things. So colleges, universities, governmental organizations, ecclesiastical work, that kind of thing. So, frequently working on basically big buildings or in big buildings, or for projects that go onto big buildings in some fashion or another. So that's a lot of what I spend my time doing. And the way I find most of that work is honestly through the company that houses my studio. So since I was a graduate student at the Reinhardt School of Sculpture at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is in Baltimore, I got involved with Hillgartner Natural Stone Company, which is based here in downtown Baltimore. And they're the oldest existing continually operational stone company in the U.S. And so I began working with them when I was a graduate student, just because I was actually looking for stone material. And shortly after I graduated, and I obviously was leaving my studio at the university, or at the college, I was invited to move my studio into their stone shop. And I've been working with them ever since. And so they, of course, have been around, by American terms, forever. So they get a lot of calls for different kinds of jobs. And so I get certain calls for certain jobs, and they get certain calls for certain jobs. And we're able to kind of work together to basically use each other's skill sets and facilities, of course, to kind of take on these projects that, I wouldn't necessarily come across, or they wouldn't necessarily come across. And a lot of course, what they do is needed by these institutions, and particularly because we are so close to Washington, D.C., which of course is the seat of our federal government. There's all kinds of, everything in D.C. is made out of stone, and, it's all falling apart at various times or in need of something to be carved into it. So quite a lot of my time is spent doing basically text and typography work. I carve an awful lot of letters and things.
So do you get any design input on that, or is that just really working to the brief from the architects and designers? Typography, that's going on donor walls and memorial walls and things.
It depends on the project. In most cases, I would say, for the stuff coming through Hillgartner, not always, but most better than half, there's basically a predetermined design. They're already, dealing with an architect who may or may not have a designer, who may or may not have a typographer, who may or may not have a sign specialist or something like that. So, it's entirely possible that everything is being designed, and at this point, they just need somebody to get that thing into stone. If it's someone, more often than not, if they're coming to me directly for it, then I'm doing the design because they've found me through other channels, or they're coming to me as a designer and they want my input on to exactly what that lettering and the text and typography is going to look like. So that's really fun when I get to do something that the way I would envision it. So it really just depends on like what we're working on.
Okay. And what about your own work then? So what have you been working on recently?
Let's see. I most recently completed a project that I never really imagined that I would be doing, based on kind of how I felt about what was going on at this U.S.'s southern border in terms of immigrant families coming in seeking asylum, being separated from their own children. And, it's something that's obviously affected by my having kids. I have a 6-year-old and an 11-month-old. And, hearing about that, I would say the way that most of my own sculptural work kind of starts is basically just an image in my head. I'll see something, and I generally cannot, get that image or idea out of my brain. And I have this idea that making a sculpture or producing a sculpture of it will do that. We'll kind of get this thought or image out of my own head. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, I had this kind of recurring thought or image after, obviously reading and just listening to the news. And it basically just kind of became the only thing I could think about. And literally I would wake up thinking about this, and just having this utter sense of rage at the intention of it. And I think that is the thing that bothered me. There's a lot of awful things that happen all the time, and people kept referring to like what's going on there as a tragedy. And I thought that was really, their heart's in the right place, but inappropriate. A tragedy is like an accident. A tragedy is an earthquake or a hurricane. And I think what's going on there would be better defined as an atrocity and as an intentional act of evil. I know this is wrong. This was something that was intentionally done, and it was intentionally be as difficult and hateful as possible to be used as a punitive thing for the reason of being a deterrent. And that I have trouble thinking of anything more wrong than that. And so I have in the past not been particularly interested in making whatever might be perceived as a political statement with artwork. But, the fact of the matter is really, we're all people and everything is politics, whether or not we like to admit it. So while I've always considered the work that I do on every level in my personal sculpture to be humanist, and empathetic in a lot of cases, it's always based on something I'm thinking of or seeing or something that I think is a general interconnectivity all people have. In this particular instance, I felt like the message needed to be very overt. If people really, have the time and want to look back at my catalog of work, I would say the vast majority of the work that I do has some kind of political slant to it or meaning, or could be perceived that way. It's just that I've never been particularly interested in discussing it up until now, where I think we are in a new era in terms of how our American political discourse is occurring, and it's really not the time to be, cagey about it anymore. And I felt like it's kind of incumbent on those who have even a minor, tiny little small voice, it's just a few thousand followers on Instagram or whatever, to kind of stand up and make artwork that they care about and that says something, and to make sure it's clear what they're saying and not kind of back away from that stance. Nothing in my mind could be more clearly black and white or right or wrong about this. You can talk about the policies and the politics behind it, but that has little to do with the things that were, again, very conscious decisions by people to do one of the worst things I can ever imagine certainly happening to me. So that's kind of where that grew out of.
So that artwork that we're talking about is called Separation Anxiety.
Permanent separation anxiety.
Permanent separation anxiety. What sort of response have you had to it?
Generally positive. Not completely, of course. And it's funny. I think there's been a handful of people that have made negative comments or something like about that on various social media platforms via, Instagram or Facebook and stuff. But, very few that are negative in a way that really was, that there were very few negative responses that made the counter argument. I mean, it's really almost an indefensible position unless you're a monster. But, I think that some of the most, at least the responses that I felt were the most useful, or the ones that I felt the best about, were, a couple of people that felt like, yeah, this is what art can contribute to our democracy, because it's like, I'm not an activist. I'm not, I don't, hold signs and I don't tend to, go on marches. That's really not my thing. And, what do I'm think, what can I do? I'm a sculptor and I'm a carver, and this is what I can do. I'm a memorial maker. And I feel like, again, we as a country or as people are not very good at memorializing like bad stuff contemporaneously. With hindsight, there are absolutely memorials and things like that to atrocities. Absolutely. I've researched and studied quite a lot of them, but things like that don't tend to happen in the here and now. And it's, obviously something that's hard to do for that reason. But in this case, if I can do something that's my own work, it's uncommissioned, and I'm not going through a panel of site supervisors or a board of directors or anything like that, or a public art commission or whatever. I'm just making what I want. I have the ability to make something that could stand or exist as a memorial. It's something that's carved out of a block of stone that has its own specific history and kind of concept behind it based on just the material, which is, again, one of the ways where using something like stone and it having that baggage and association with memorial is a great thing. It's a good thing, as opposed to being something that's like the crutch where people might view them differently in a gallery setting. So that kind of response has been good. And, someone who said something to the effect of, hey, can I share this? I feel like this piece might actually change the minds of those people who do not share my political beliefs. And, of course, my thought is, fuck yeah. Sorry. Yes, absolutely. But yeah, that's the idea. I don't think I'm going to reach people that are already on what I consider to be the wrong side of this. I think that's very unlikely. But I think that voter apathy is what allowed this to happen to begin with. And that, I think, can be changed. I think laziness or people feeling disenfranchised, that can be changed. I don't think you're going to change the opinion of someone who's like, yeah, we should absolutely tear these people apart because they're not as good as us. They're different, or they don't look the same, or they come from a different part of the world that's south of us. Like someone like that, I'm not going to reach. That's not going to happen. But this all happened through a political process. We allowed it, and we can undo it.
Now, what I think is really interesting is that you're producing this work contemporaneously as, the story is unfolding on the political scene. So, it is news of the moment, but then, the artwork is responding to it in real time as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge for me, this kind of stuff, because I'm a stone carver, it happens in fits and starts. I'm not, a high producer, I guess. If I make half a dozen pieces a year, that's really good. And it's almost certainly less. So, like this, for instance, it was very important, but I basically had to take, it sounds stupid, but I had to take like 4 weeks off of work, and I actually, had to put other things aside and just stop doing other stuff to get it done. And I don't always have the ability to do that. I mean, to be totally honest, I have other responsibilities. I have, a wife and 2 kids, and I'm, every time I do a sculpture, and I've been very lucky with, sales of some of the fine art, but at the same point, I can't just say that's all I'm going to do. So, basically every time I'm making a sculpture, that isn't a commissioned sculpture, which is of course a different story. A commission for a collector is a totally different thing. But every time I'm making this uncommissioned sculpture, I'm basically taking an unpaid vacation, So that makes it difficult to do stuff, like you say, in real time, contemporaneously with current events.
And you've done residencies and things as well in the past, haven't you?
Well, technically just one. Right after I graduated from Reinhardt, I did a residency at the Vermont Studio Center up in Johnson, Vermont, which was a place. It's a great residency program, and obviously it's near a lot of quarries that had the stone that I wanted to work with. So. Also, I should mention also Micah paid for it, so that was kind of nice. So I did that basically right after I graduated, and I was kind of in transition between my grad school studio and what became my permanent studio here at Hillgartner. And honestly, since then I haven't done one, just because the combination of I've been quite busy with work, and also my studio here it's pretty badass, and I'm pretty comfortable, which may not be such a good thing for an artist. But basically, it's got everything. The facilities are ideal. So if I'm not making work, me and my life, those are the responsible reasons. It's not because I don't have a great studio and a residency program to do it. So I feel like maybe it's something someday I'll do again. But right now, honestly, with 2 little kids at home, and a wife who's extremely supportive, but, probably, I think I would feel like a jerk, kind of just being like, hey, I'm going to take off for a month to make some artwork, sorry.
So talking about facilities, we, on a previous conversation, sort of touched on modern technology around, things like CNC cutters and all of that. And how does that influence, both your work or, other people working in the discipline?
Well, I mean, it certainly has a huge impact on contemporary stone sculpture in general, because it basically allows you to not have to, well, we'll do what I did. Basically, you can take that process of saying, all right, I feel like I'm an artist and I think I'm an artist, and now I need to go learn the skill to make art in the material I want to make it in. And you can skip those 4 or 5 years and then just hire a machine to do it. And now, to be fair, this is not new in a historical sense. I mean, people have been using ateliers for hundreds of years. I was in a show at the Walters Art Museum just a couple of years ago about this exact thing, where it described, the studio of William Henry Reinhardt and how he used a single studio in Florence of carvers to execute his stonework, where he was just making a model in clay. That's kind of the process now with those CNC machines, where you can just make a model in something. Of course, now that model can be basically virtual. It's just digital. You can make something entirely on a computer. You send that to the machine, and the machine is going to route that out in material. So the model itself may never even exist in 3 real dimensions. So obviously the process is somewhat different, but it's not that there haven't been artists that have been, making artwork in stone that they haven't physically touched. That's been going on forever. But, as another stone carver that I mentioned to you, Steve Shaheen, I think had the best line about this is, using that technology, basically whoever has the biggest credit card, can make the biggest art, because it is expensive to use those things. But yeah, I think that it all kind of comes down to how the viewer feels about it and what the intent is. If the viewer feels like the artwork benefits from the process behind it, and that process being driven by a human, then they're going to feel differently about it than someone who doesn't and thinks the final product, no matter how it's made, is all that matters.
But what about, like you said you moved into carving in that, after starting off in illustration. So there must have been for you like a tactile, sensibility that drew you to the material, and then actually the physical working of it as well, like people do with whatever, textiles and their thing, right? They just have an innate affinity with that material.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I just always liked working with my hands, even down from being a little kid, whittling wood with a pocket knife. I was always just into that kind of thing. So I would guess a person like that isn't going to be as interested in using some technology that takes out part of that process. Now, there are certain sculptors that's part of the process, and they're just going to have these things roughed out first and then carve them. But to me, I know that early part of the sculpture, that's kind of the funnest part. I mean, that's the part where you get to take a hammer and make stone explode, like just absolutely go crazy. And I mean, yeah, you got to be careful about it, because something can go wrong in a real hurry. But I mean, that's the exciting part of the process. Like for me, and this is part of my resistance to working with assistants on stuff, in the sense, because I have, like this recent sculpture, I had a couple days where I had to do other stuff. And so I had, I was able to say, okay, try to block out this part, like connect these lines or take this part out. But the thing is, like, that's the part that I want to do. That's the early part where things happen in a hurry and your stone looks different day to day or even hour to hour. Whereas the final stages of that process, where you're putting the finishes and the texture and stuff on, which are a huge part of my work, and maybe what is, some people would say, is most unique about it. But those early stages where you're, literally taking a 3-pound hammer and a pitching wedge and knocking off huge chunks of stone, like that's the fun part. That's the exciting part. So I don't want to miss out on that. And I mean, not to be too depressing about it, but it's like, I'm not going to be this age forever. I can only do this stuff for so long. Stone carvers don't have a great shelf life necessarily. So there's only a certain period of my life that I'm going to be able to go and literally break rocks. So I kind of want to take advantage of that while I can.
And so you've got work at the Smithsonian as well, haven't you? How did that come about?
Yeah, it did. I I do. So yeah, I have some work that's in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery, and that happened because I would say, what was it, about 5-6 years ago? The gallery had its 40th anniversary, and for that anniversary, the curator, who was himself a young guy, Nicholas Bell, decided instead of doing a 40-year retrospective on their entire collection, he decided just to do something completely new and find 40 artists working in America under the age of 40 to include in the show. And the gallery itself specifically focuses on like craft artwork or artwork that has a craft aspect to it. So he basically, put out feelers and found 40 artists under the age of 40 working in the U.S. And I was one of those lucky artists. And that was, let's see, I think it was in 2012 or 12 or 13.
Amazing.
And so when they had the show, they made an effort to collect work from I believe each of the artists. I can't be sure, but I think most of the 40 artists had some work that was acquired by the collection.
That's so good. What else have you got coming up? Anything?
That's a great question. Let's see. At this point, I don't know. I just took down a show here in Baltimore for the Sondheim Prize semifinalists, and as far as what the next show is going to be, I have no idea. It's a Washington, D.C., really Baltimore-based art prize for, the arts. But I think it's primarily visual arts. So I'm not sure if that is the same. It's the Janet and Walter Sondheim Prize. I do not know if they're the same family as Stephen Sondheim or not. I'm not really sure what the
I love Stephen Sondheim.
No, I don't know. Not my favorite part. I'm much happier making it. So
and where can people find you online?
They can find my work at www.sebastianworks.com and on Instagram at just under Sebastian Martorana. Do I need to spell that?
No, I'll put it all in the show notes, so no problem. Thanks so much for talking to me today, Sebastian. It's great having a chat.
Thanks so much, Gita. I appreciate the opportunity.